So our next speaker, Nick Desbarats, he'll correct my pronunciation in just a moment, is an independent educator and best-selling author. He has taught data visualization and information dashboard design to thousands of professionals in over a dozen countries at organizations such as NASA, Bloomberg, Visa, the United Nations, Shopify, the Internal Revenue Service, and perhaps my favorite, the Central Bank of Tanzania. Nick is the author of the Amazon #1 new release, Practical Charts, that came out last year, and the upcoming Practical Dashboards books, and he regularly contributes articles to the Journal of the Data Visualization Society, Nightingale. Thank you for that, Nick. That are among the publications most widely read and shared. He also regularly delivers main stage talks at conferences such as Tableau Conference, TDWI World Conference, SaaS Explorers, Data Innovation Summit, and others, and has lectured at Yale, the University of Toronto, and the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. So with that, I would love to welcome Nick to the stage to kick us off with his presentation on how to choose a chart type.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Amanda. That was a very successful pronunciation of my name. Well done. It's not an easy one, invented by silly French people a long time ago. Absolutely delighted to be here, of course. Some really great big ideas so far today. Unfortunately, though, I'm not really intelligent enough to have big ideas, so I'm going to bring things way down and get very hands-on, very tactical, and talk about how to choose a chart type. And as a lot of you probably, actually probably realize already, this is a lot harder than most people tend to think that actually is. I'm going to skip this because Amanda already did a great job introducing me, and I can buy some time. Oh, books, by the way, I'm going to mention at the end. I'm doing a book signing a little bit later, but I'll give you, all right. But I'll give you the details of that after my talk. So, how do we choose chart types? Well, a lot of people, maybe not a lot of people in this room, but a lot of people out there in the real world think that this is a very simple thing, right? We can just use simple rules of thumb, like, for example, to show the breakdown of a total, just use a pie chart. To show values with locations, just use a map. To show data over time, just use a line chart, right? What could be simpler? Well, let's maybe have a closer look at one of these. Let's take, to show data over time, use a line chart. Is this something that holds up well in practice? Well, in a situation like this, we're just looking at the monthly donations for the last 12 months for our charity here. And yeah, I think showing this as a standard line chart is going to be pretty safe in many situations. Let's look at maybe a couple of other scenarios. Let's look at, for example, so now what we're trying to say is that our donations here were under 160K, 20% lower than September. And so this isn't really a story about pattern of change, about increase or decrease. Really, it's just a story about two individual time periods. And in this case, I probably actually go with a bar chart rather than a line chart, because a bar chart really invites our eyes to consider these as more kind of discrete individual values rather than a single kind of pattern or continuum of values. I don't think a line chart would be a mistake in a case like this, but if this is the insight I'm trying to communicate, bars, I think, probably going to be a better choice. Or what about this? So this is showing how many medals various countries won during the Olympics. We got Canada in there, which means that it must have been the Winter Olympics, because that's the only time where we win medals. I'm from Canada. And this would be fine if we just want to show your cumulative total number of medals throughout the Olympics. But let's say that the insight that we wanted to communicate here was specifically that the Netherlands started out strong, but then lost ground to other countries. So the Netherlands, that's this kind of red line. Do I have a laser? Oh, it doesn't really show up there. But you can see it's kind of the red line in the middle there. Now, does this look like something losing ground? Not really, right? It looks like something increasing. Right? If you think about it hard enough, you might sort of, after a while realize that, yeah, I guess relative to other countries, maybe they did lose ground. But what if we were to show this data as a special kind of line chart called a bumps chart? And so this is a line chart where instead of showing changes in quantity, we're showing changes in rank. And now I can see much more clearly that, oh yeah, the Netherlands did actually lose ground, actually have a line going down. They started out in first place, and then over time they finished off in fifth. And so this is a situation where even though we're showing data over time, maybe a standard line chart is not actually the best choice. Or how about this situation? So we're looking at our daily expenses for the last 31 days, for all the days of May, but clearly something went horribly wrong because we don't actually have data for most of the days, right? We only have like 6 values. Maybe the server crashed, whatever, we had some sort of horrible data loss. But yet we still, if we show this data as a standard line chart, well, it looks like, we're sort of showing a pattern of change. But the reality is that we probably don't have enough information to know what that pattern of change actually was. We don't have enough values. If we had all the data, if we had data for each day, it might have looked like this, or it might have looked like this, or it might have looked like this. And so the fact is that we don't really know what the pattern of change was, but if we show this as a standard line chart, it kind of suggests that we do know what actually happened, when in fact we don't. And so I would consider this to actually be a mistake. Right? This is misleading. It's making it look like we know things that we don't actually know. And so we shouldn't really use a standard line chart in this case. I think we pretty much have to use what's called a dot plot. And so this is, it might be an unfamiliar chart type to your audience, but at least it's not making stuff up, because that was kind of the problem with the standard line chart, right? In a dot plot like this, it's very clear what we know and what we don't. There are grid lines there, by the way. They're just not really showing up in that in the projector here. Or how about this situation? So here we have the price of a TV, a fictional television model, being sold by a retailer, and we're showing how that price has changed over time, again, using a standard line chart. But I actually have 2 concerns here. The first is that it basically looks like this TV had a price at the beginning of April, right? The first period there, it was like $400. And then basically there was kind of this sort of gap where nothing happened. And then the price was $350 at the beginning of May. And yet that's not what actually happened, right? This TV did have a price the whole time. It was $400. And probably a bigger concern that I have is that I've seen people who maybe have a little bit less chart reading experience interpret a chart like this to mean that the price started at $400 at the beginning of April, and then it steadily declined until the beginning of May. That in the, let's say the middle of April, it was like $375 or something, and yet that, once again, is not what actually happened. And so I think that this is a red X. This is a mistake. Instead, I think we pretty much have to use a step chart. Right? And so now it's just showing the data accurately. It's very clear that, oh yes, from the beginning of April to the beginning of May, it was $400 the whole time. Again, maybe a less familiar chart type. And in the workshops that I teach, I talk about how to quickly teach people how to read new chart types like this. But yet another situation where using a standard line chart was problematic. Sometimes people will ask me, okay, so what's different about this situation? Why did we want to use a step chart here instead of a standard line chart? And really there's kind of 2 conditions that kind of are applied to this data set. The first is that it's data that occurs at irregular intervals of time, right? The price can change 5 times in one day and then stay the same for 3 weeks, right? It's not a daily value or a weekly value or a monthly value, it's an anytime value. And the second is that these are values that persist, and so, or until the next value occurs. And so when the price drops to $350, that value remains in effect until the next price change occurs. And so if that's the case, then I think you pretty much have to use a step chart. You cannot use a standard line chart. Once you realize this, by the way, you'll start to see data like this all over the place, this kind of irregular, persistent data in things like the balance of a bank account, the inventory level of a product, the current high bid of an auction item, the current long jump distance world record. These are all irregular, persistent time series, in which case you have to show them as a step chart. So yet another situation where using a standard line chart, not really the best choice. Or how about this situation? We're showing individual sales transactions, right? So not daily totals or weekly totals. We're showing individual transactions. And it looks like sales, of course, are trending down. But if we were to take the same data and aggregate it, let's say on a weekly basis, we would actually see that sales are actually going up. And so this chart, the standard line chart on the left here, is a red X. This is a mistake, right? And instead, I think if we need to show individual values like this and not aggregations, then we'd have to use what I call a thin bar chart. I couldn't find a name for it, so I had to give it one. And so now it looks a lot less like a pattern of change, and more like a bunch of individual kind of discrete values. When would it make sense to use a chart type like this? Well, it is where, like I said, we need to show individual values, right? We need to say something about individual sales transactions, not daily totals or weekly totals, for example. The values occur at irregular intervals of time. I might have 5 sales in one day and then nothing for 2 weeks, and where the values are not persistent. So it's a little different than what we were talking about a few minutes ago. Because for a sales transaction, for example, once it occurs at a single point in time, and then basically there's nothing after that until the next sales transaction. So these are non-persistent values. And so if these 3 conditions apply, pretty much have to use a thin bar chart. You can't use a standard line chart. Or what about this situation? So here, once again, we're a charity. We've just run a big advertising blitz, and we want to compare our donations in the 5 regions in which we operate before the big ad blitz and then after the big ad blitz. Probably the most common way that I'll see data like this represented is as a clustered bar chart, but I'm not really a fan, right? Because first of all, it just doesn't look like things changing over time, right? If you kind of squint, so you can't really read the text, it just looks like kind of 5 groups of 2 values. It doesn't look like things going up or going down. And if I want to, make sort of ask even basic questions like which regions went up, which regions went down, I can get there, but I'm going to have to work a bit. It's like, okay, this one went up and then this one went down. And so instead, I could use what's called a slope chart, which is a standard line chart where there are 2 periods of time only. And so right away, you can see that there are some benefits here. At least it looks like things change over time, right? If you squint, so you can't read any of the text, you can tell, oh, yeah, this is a story of things going up and down, which wasn't really the case for our clustered bar chart. And even if I hadn't made the central line a different color, you would have immediately recognized that there were 4 things going up and 1 thing going down, which again wasn't as obvious in that clustered bar chart. I actually never use this chart type though, and I'm going to explain why in a moment. There's another way of showing this kind of data though, which is as an arrow chart. I can get basically most of the same benefits I think that I can from a slope chart. Right away I can see what went up, what went down, by how much, and so I think it's a reasonable alternative. Now if I were to ask you though, based on this chart, which region improved their donation performance the most? What would you guys say? South, right? Yeah, it's got the kind of the longest line. But if you think about it for a second, if we're talking about improvements in donation performance, really we should probably be talking about relative change, i.e. change as a percentage. And so maybe we should show that, right? So we said, okay, the South improved the most. Let's add those percentage changes. Whoops. So as it turns out, the South was not the biggest improver. It was actually the North. And so this is a very dangerous situation. If I only show the chart on the left, people would think that the South improved the most in relative terms, and yet it didn't. And so I think that this is actually the only safe way to show this kind of data. And that is why I don't use slope charts, right? Which region improved the most? Most people are going to say the South, and yet, as we just saw, that's wrong, right? It was actually this one. So yet another situation where a standard line chart maybe is not the best choice. So where are we at? Well, we've seen that, yes, sometimes standard line charts are a good way to show data over time, but there are plenty of situations when it's not. And so, our simple rule of thumb of, always use standard line charts to show data over time really isn't holding up very well at all. It's going to steer us wrong in many situations. And this is probably also why many experts, people with a lot of chart creation experience tend to think that this is just too kind of complex, it's too nuanced to codify. Any guideline that we might come up with or might formulate is going to have so many exceptions that it's just not going to be useful. And that this is essentially, chart type selection is essentially a skill that requires judgment and intuition that you just have to kind of develop, right, with practice and experience over time, and it might even take years to develop this skill. I'm going to challenge that, though. I'm going to assert that maybe we can actually come up with guidelines that are going to account for all of these exceptions, and that can be used by anyone of any experience level. So let's maybe try to build that into a decision tree, right? So here on the right, we have all of the possible ways of showing data over time. As we saw, there are lots of considerations that go into choosing which is going to be the best one in any given situation. So we might first ask, okay, how many time periods do we have? Because if we only have 2, we're going straight to an arrow chart, right? That kind of double arrow chart showing the kind of absolute or nominal change and the relative change. So if we have more than 2 time periods, well, then our next question might be, do we have enough values to estimate the pattern of change? Because if we don't, we go straight to a dot plot, right? All the other chart types are going to be misleading if we're missing too many values. Let's say no, we have lots of values, we're not missing very many. Next question might be, do the values occur at regular intervals of time? And if they do, and it's more important to feature patterns of change, standard line chart. That's when that makes sense. Don't take pictures yet, I'm not done. Just wait a second, it's coming. But if we want to feature individual periods, well, then we should use a bar chart. Whereas if we want to show changes in rank, then we would use a bumps chart. Let's say that our values do not occur at regular intervals of time. Then our next question might be, are the values persistent? And if they are, then we should use a step chart. If they are not, and we need to feature individual values, individual sales transactions, for example, well, then we should go with a thin bar chart. And if we need to show summary values, weekly totals, monthly averages, well, then we're going to go to that sort of branch where we have standard line charts, bar charts, and bumps charts. Couple of things. So I'm kind of asserting, anyways, that a decision tree like this is going to allow chart creators to make expert level chart type choices in a very wide variety of situations. And it can be used by chart creators and of any skill level. Right? I just taught you how to use this in 10 minutes, right? And so, and you don't have to, like, obviously this room has a lot more expertise than most, but this can be taught to most people, even if they don't have a lot of chart experience. And like I said, I just taught it to you in 10 minutes. And so you don't need necessarily years of experience, I think, to learn how to make this kind of decision very effectively. And this, by the way, is actually kind of a reduced version because I only have a limited amount of time in this talk. The full version actually looks like this. So there are actually 9 common ways of showing data over time and about a dozen decision factors that need to be taken into account. And this is, by the way, just one of 8 decision trees that I teach in my course, and that's in my book that I'm going to be doing the book signing for a little bit afterwards. Which, by the way, I'm in the process of merging these into kind of the master decision tree. 50 chart types, all represented. As you can see, I'm not finished yet, though. It's a bit of a nightmare, but hopefully I'll have that done soon. It will be totally useless, by the way, right? Because it'll be so difficult to use. But it's much easier to use as individual trees. But I don't know, maybe I'll sell it on posters or t-shirts. I don't know, we'll see. Some of you might be thinking, I've seen these before. Right? I've seen chart chooser diagrams. They've been floating around for a long time online. Every couple of days, I see one pop up on LinkedIn or Twitter. And if we just have a close look at one of the sort of the popular ones. So this is the part of one of those diagrams that deals with choosing a chart type to show data over time. And basically, I wish it were this simple. Right? Because obviously this is a lot simpler than the decision tree that I was showing you a few minutes ago. But, lots of common situations not accounted for, right? It doesn't address like if the values are, for example, occur at irregular intervals of time. What do we do if we have missing values? What about persistent values? Just not really kind of accounted for. And lots of essential chart types are not there, right? There's only 4 chart types. As you saw, though, I think we need at least 8 or 9 in order to cover off, the most common situations. And so, unfortunately, I think that these very often do point to obviously bad chart type choices that no one in this room would actually agree with, right? And they require a lot of a lot of judgment on the part of the user, right? You have to be essentially quite an experienced chart creator in order to use something like this effectively. Whereas something like this is more complicated, right? It's a more complex decision tree, but I think that all common situations are actually accounted for. All essential chart types are included, and I think it's just a lot more reliable, right? You can follow it regardless of what experience level you have, and it's going to guide you to pretty reliably to a good chart type choice. Some of you might have also seen things like this. These are sort of same idea, but instead of diagrams, they're sort of taxonomies or catalogs of chart types where, basically it's kind of a list of chart types and sort of descriptions of each, which are intended to guide people to the chart type choices. But if we look at like kind of a typical chart chooser catalog taxonomy, and we look at what they say about something like standard line charts, you're going to see something like this, right? And again, I wish it were this simple. But as we just saw, deciding when to use or not use a standard line chart is just more complicated than this. Like if you were to kind of derive these sort of guidelines from the decision tree that I just showed you, it would look like this. Right? There's just more factors that go into this choice. By the way, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that these are rules, right? I understand a lot of you know it's kind of a dark history there of people saying, this is the absolute way of doing it. I call them guidelines. There is flexibility here. My friend Alberto Cairo, when he saw these, he said, I'm going to steal his phrase. He said, these are like training wheels, right? Especially for people who maybe don't have a lot of data visualization experience. It allows them to get up and running very quickly and make expert level chart type choices, and to avoid falling over, right? Making fairly kind of what most of us consider to be fairly kind of obviously bad chart type choices. It's going to stop them from doing that. But experts, people who have more experience, a lot of people in this room are going to probably have good reasons to deviate from these decision trees, which is fine, right? Totally cool. If you know why you're deviating from it, then that's great. But the first step in knowing kind of when to quote unquote break the rules is kind of knowing what the rules are in the first place. Although I hate that term, I prefer the term guidelines. This is the infomercial portion of my talk. It'll be brief. If you'd like to take the course that I was talking about, there's 3 ways of doing it. I teach lots of private, in-person, and online workshops. That's my email there. I do 3 public workshops a year. I'm getting the red light in a second here. The next one's going to be in October. Brand new announcing it for the first time in public here that I have made a on-demand version of my Practical Charts course, which is available for pre-order as of right now. It just went up on my site. 25% off until the June 25th launch. That's when it'll actually go up. Book signing is going to be during the cocktail, which is right after the last session, I believe. I'm going to be at one of the tables outside here. And so if you'd like to purchase books, again, at a discount, and have me write all over them for some reason, then by all means, let me know. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Do I get a mic again? Am I unmiked? Beep, beep. Yeah. Welcome to the cozy chairs. So we did start a few minutes late, so we are going to be adjusting our calendar a bit and taking a bit of time off the unconferences just to make sure we hold our time for questions. So let's go ahead and let's start with questions over here at the podium, at the mic. I think, Zane, you're monitoring our virtual attendees, right? And we want to make sure we get some of their questions in here for this talk.
I am, yes. Let's start with what kind of data would you find best suits a ribbon chart?
A ribbon chart. I guess, to be honest, I haven't made up, I don't know who knows what a ribbon chart is. Kind of hard to explain without showing one, but I kind of haven't made up my mind about those, because when I was going through that exercise of creating those decision trees for those 50 chart types, I actually ended up with about a dozen that were kind of left over that I still haven't found a good use case for them yet. And I think ribbon charts are in that list. I'm still looking for good use cases for them. Not to say they're not out there, but I haven't really come across good use cases yet. There are others, controversial ones, box plots. I don't think we should be using those anymore. I guess some people agree.
Fighting words for some people. in this
Yeah,
room,
bullet
probably,
graphs, but I do like pie charts.
More fighting words, my gosh. Matthias, let's go ahead and let's take Mike to your side and then we'll bounce back and forth.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. So decision trees, we know them from machine learning, for example. So have you thought of creating an AI and training it with your curated charts and then make this available to users?
So I actually did try to load the manuscript of my book into ChatGPT. You know, you can make your own GPT. And then I started asking it questions about my own book. And it got about 75% of them right, which to me is far too few, because 25% of them was like fantasy, like clearly pulled from other parts of its training data. But yeah, no, I do think that you wouldn't need like a machine learning, really sophisticated system for something like this. That big master decision tree, it could be represented in code actually fairly easily. I just have to figure out what the sequencing is, because that was really the hard part of doing what I showed you, was listing out, okay, what are all of the criteria that go into this decision, and then how to sequence those. And so I'm still kind of working on that. But once you figure that out, it's just a bunch of like, if then, right? If you were to just code it in very simple terms.
I was just thinking of mixing chart types as well, so that you could account for with an AI maybe, but thank you.
Sure.
New project for Matthias, maybe? Matt?
Yeah, so you kind of hinted at this a little bit during the talk, which was this question of convincing people to use chart types that they're maybe a little less familiar with. I was having an interesting conversation on the break about the notion of visualization dialects, right? So I'm an academic. My dialect is going to be a little different from like business intelligence or data journalism or whatever, right? But I think there's a lot of value in trying to convince people to use charts that are a little bit more appropriate, so long as you can give them the training and the scaffolding. And I wonder if you kind of have some thoughts about that. And I'll say one other thing before that, which is, as an example, your decision tree that includes bar charts, in my area, we just would not use any of the bar chart branches and just replace all of those branches with dot plots or scatter plots. Your decision tree would be much simpler, and we wouldn't have to like, deal with all of the weird issues with like discretization versus continuous values.
Well, I mean, if your bars are showing like summary values, means, medians, that kind of thing, sure, but you're not always showing means and medians, right? Like if you
sure. Like, I mean, if you have like a histogram or something like that, you still use a bar encoding because it has an area interpretation where the total area under a set of bars actually means something. But in any situation where you have like a discrete value, I think bars just introduce many misinterpretations, and if you get rid of them, things are actually better.
I think, it's interesting because I wrote an article about this recently where I did assert that, in fact, bar charts are the most complex chart type, because bar charts are unique in that you can actually show any kind of data in a bar chart. You can show time series, distribution, location-based data, as long as location is not that important. And so the alternative, when you're trying to decide if you should use a bar chart or another chart type, the alternative to bar charts are everything else. And so in order to know when to use a bar chart, you have to know when to use every other chart type. But I think ruling them out and saying you should never use bar charts, I think that might be going a bit far.
Well, I think in pretty much every case where you could use a bar chart, you could use a scatter plot instead.
Gentlemen. I have a line of people with questions.
I'm all in this discussion.
I want to know.
Cocktail hour. Pin me down.
How do you teach people?
Okay. So three tricks that I teach in my data visualization course. Insights, that's what I call them, where we put basically annotations in the chart that would be very obvious to somebody who already knows how to read that chart type. But if somebody is trying to figure it out on their own, they're like, oh, okay, you can kind of handhold them through it. And then there's bait and switch, where I show them kind of a simpler chart type that they're familiar with, and then it becomes clear why that chart type is not saying what they need to know. And then I swap in the more complicated one, so it makes them it kind of opens a space in their brain for a new chart type. And then the third one is what I call gentle reveal, where for a bumps chart, for example, instead of showing, like if the audience doesn't know how to read that chart type, you just show like one line, and then you explain that, and then you show another one, explain that, and then you show all the lines. So you introduce it in steps. So there are ways, but to explain chart types fairly easily to audiences who don't know how to read them. Having said that, I'm still a big fan of always using the simplest possible representation of the data and only reaching for a potentially unfamiliar chart type when the simple chart types really just don't say what the audience needs to know, which, as we just saw, happens unfortunately fairly often.
So it does sound like we have some heated debates happening. I'm also, hopefully we can carry those conversations off into the break and the other time. I do want to go ahead and allow just this one last question on the other side. You've been very patient. Go ahead. If it's a quick one, we'll close out with this one last question.
I kind of forgot the question. No, I'm kidding.
Okay.
Sorry. Did we distract you?
Would you like to, are you deferring to Alex at the other mic?
My name is Becker. It's half question, half pushback, because you assert that people with very little skill can use this type of chart or decision-making thing, but you include assumptions about data literacy in the decision-making process. And what I would like to kind of, and maybe the question part is, if we want to implement this as a common, practice, this is the thing to go to. One of the things that is most important is simplicity and accessibility, in the sense of everyone can use it. So how would you make it accessible and make it simple to use as someone who's maybe not living and breathing data visualization every day?
Yeah, well, like I said in my my fight over here, this is I always strongly advocate for the simplest possible representation of the data. But as we just saw, or I hope anyways, I illustrated with some of those examples, sometimes we have no choice, right? Because the simplest possible representation of the data either misrepresents it fundamentally, or it just doesn't say what the audience needs to know, right? And so then it's a useless chart. And so sometimes, unfortunately, you just have no choice, right? Like, you only reach for those potentially unfamiliar chart types as a last resort. But unfortunately, that last resort happens with some frequency. And so just saying, oh, no, we're just going to use the simple chart type, even though it misrepresents the data, or even though it doesn't say what the audience needs to know, it's a rock and a hard place, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Alex, is your question a short one?
Very stupid. How do you think, Nick? Is it still possible, or is it still reasonable to invent a definitely new type of chart? For example, as Stephen Few invented, the bullet chart.
I'm sure it's possible. I haven't really seen, a brand new chart type in a while. But I'm sure, this is an evolving field. Like the decision trees, for example, that I'm creating, I've already had to update them in a few cases. But I'm sure it's possible to find, to come up with new and useful chart types, because that's the thing, right? It's not just new, it has to be useful. If you want, I could come up with 50 new chart types right now. None of them will be useful, though. There will always be better alternatives. The trick is to come up with something where it is the best possible alternative for a specific set of circumstances. And I haven't seen a new one in a while, but that doesn't, I'm sure that people are going to come up with them, though.
Thank you.
All right. Big round of applause for Nick. Thank you so much.
Thank you.